I'm not giving hounds meat this month, or only very little." "Ah, Master Flurry," answered Barrett, "it's you that's pleasant. Is it give the like of this one for the dogs to ate? She's a valuable strong young mare, no more than 16 years of age, and you'd sooner be looking at her again under a sidecar than eating your dinner." "There isn't as much meat on her as 'd fatten a jackdaw," said Flurry, clinking the silver in his pockets as he searched for a matchbox. "What are you asking for her?" The old man drew cautiously up to him. "Master Flurry," he said solemnly, "I'll sell her to your honour for £5, and she'll be worth 10 after you've given her a month's grass." Flurry lit his cigarette. Then he said imperturbably, "I'll give you 7 shillings for her." Old Barrett put on his hat in silence, and in silence buttoned his coat and took hold of the stirrup leather. Flurry remained immovable. "Master Flurry," said old Barrett suddenly, with tears in his voice, "you must make it 8, sir." "Michael," called out Flurry, with apparent irrelevance, "run up to your father's and ask him would he lend me a loan of his sidecar." Half an hour later we were, improbable as it may seem, on our way to Lisheen races. We were seated upon an outside car of immemorial age, whose joints seemed to open and close again as it swung in and out of the ruts, whose tattered cushions stank of rats and mildew, whose wheels staggered and rocked like the legs of a drunken man. Between the shafts jogged the latest addition to the kennel larder, the 8-shilling mare. Flurry sat on one side, and kept her going at the rate of not less than 4 miles an hour. Lee Kelway and I held on to the other. "She'll get us as far as Lynch's, anyway," said Flurry, abandoning his first contention that she could do the whole distance, as he pulled her on to her legs after her 15th stumble. "And he'll lend us some sort of horse, if it was only a mule." "Do you notice that these cushions are very damp?" said Lee Kelway to me in a hollow undertone. "Small blame to them if they are," replied Flurry. "I've no doubt they were out under the rain all day yesterday at Mrs. Hurley's funeral." Lee Kelway made no reply, but he took his notebook out of his pocket and sat on it. We arrived at Lynch's at a little past 3, and were there confronted by the next disappointment of this disastrous day. The door of Lynch's farmhouse was locked, and nothing replied to our knocking except a puppy who barked hysterically from within. "All gone to the races," said Flurry philosophically, picking his way round the manure heap. "No matter. Here's the filly in the shed here. I know he's had her under a car." An agitating 10 minutes ensued, during which Lee Kelway and I got the 8-shilling mare out of the shafts and the harness, and Flurry, with our inefficient help, crammed the young mare into them. As Flurry had stated that she had been driven before, I was bound to believe him, but the difficulty of getting the bit into her mouth was remarkable, and so also was the crab-like manner in which she sidled out of the yard, with Flurry and myself at her head, and Lee Kelway hanging on to the back of the car to keep it from jamming in the gateway. "Sit up on the car now," said Flurry, when we got out onto the road. "I'll lead her on a bit. She's been ploughed anyway. One side of her mouth's as tough as a gad." Lee Kelway threw away the wisp of grass with which he had been cleaning his hands, and mopped his intellectual forehead. He was very silent. We both mounted the car, and Flurry, with the reins in his hand, walked beside the filly, who, with her tail clasped in, moved onward in a succession of short jerks. "Oh, she's all right," said Flurry, beginning to run and dragging the filly into a trot. "Once she gets started." Here the filly spied a pig in the neighbouring field, and despite the fact that she had probably eaten out of the same trough with it, she gave a violent side spring and broke into a gallop. "Now we're off!" shouted Flurry, making a jump at the car and clambering on. "If the traces hold, we'll do it." The English language is powerless to suggest the view halloo with which Mr. Knox ended his speech, or to do more than indicate the rigid anxiety of Lee Kelway's face as he regained his balance after the preliminary jerk and clutched the back rail. It must be said for Lynch's filly that she did not kick. She merely fled, like a dog with a kettle tied to its tail, from the pursuing rattle and jingle behind her, with the shafts buffeting her dusty sides as the car swung to and fro. Whenever she showed any signs of slackening, Flurry loosed another yell at her that renewed her panic, and thus we precariously covered another 2 or 3 miles of our journey. Had it not been for a large stone lying on the road, and had the filly not chosen to swerve so as to bring the wheel on top of it, I dare say we might have got to the races. But by an unfortunate coincidence both these things occurred, and when we recovered from the consequent shock, the tire of one of the wheels had come off and was trundling with cumbrous gaiety into the ditch. Flurry stopped the filly and began to laugh. Lee Kelway said something startlingly unparliamentary under his breath. "Well, it might be worse," Flurry said consolingly, as he lifted the tire on to the car. "We're not half a mile from a forge." We walked that half mile in funereal procession behind the car. The glory had departed from the weather, and an ugly wall of cloud was rising up out of the west to meet the sun. The hills had darkened and lost colour, and the white bog cotton shivered in a cold wind that smelt of rain. By a miracle the Smith was not at the races, owing, as he explained, to his having the toothaches. The two facts combined, producing in him a morosity only equalled by that of Lee Kelway. The Smith's sole comment on the situation was to unharness the filly and drag her into the forge, where he tied her up. He then proceeded to whistle viciously on his fingers in the direction of a cottage, and to command in tones of thunder some unseen creature to bring over a couple of baskets of turf. The turf arrived in process of time on a woman's back, and was arranged in a circle in a yard at the back of the forge. The tire was bedded in it, and the turf was with difficulty kindled at different points. "You'll not get to the races this day," said the Smith, yielding to a sardonic satisfaction. "The turf's wet, and I haven't one to do a hand's turn for me." He laid the wheel on the ground and lit his pipe. Lee Kelway looked pallidly about him over the spacious empty landscape of brown mountain slopes, patched with golden firs and seamed with grey walls. I wondered if he were as hungry as I. We sat on stones opposite the smouldering ring of turf and smoked, and Flurry beguiled the Smith into grim and calumnious confidences about every horse in the country. After about an hour, during which the turf went out 3 times, and the weather became more and more threatening, a girl with a red petticoat over her head appeared at the gate of the yard, and said to the Smith: "The horse is gone away from ye." "Where?" exclaimed Flurry, springing to his feet. "I met him walking west the road there below, and when I thought to turn him, he commenced to gallop." "Pulled her head out of the headstall," said Flurry, after a rapid survey of the forge. "She's near home by now." It was at this moment that the rain began. The situation could scarcely have been better stage managed. After reviewing the position, Flurry and I decided that the only thing to do was to walk to a public house a couple of miles further on, feed there if possible, hire a car, and go home. It was an uphill walk, with mild, generous raindrops striking thicker and thicker on our faces. No one talked, and the grey clouds crowded up from behind the hills like billows of steam. Lee Kelway bore it all with egregious resignation. I cannot pretend that I was at heart sympathetic, but by virtue of being his host I felt responsible for the breakdown, for his light suit, for everything, and divined his sentiment of horror at the first sight of the public house. It was a long, low cottage, with a line of dripping elm trees overshadowing it. Empty cars and carts round its door, and a babel from within, made it evident that the race-goers were pursuing a gradual homeward route. The shop was crammed with steaming countrymen, whose loud, brawling voices, all talking together, roused my English friend to his first remark since we had left the forge. "Surely, Yates, we are not going to go into that place," he said severely. "Those men are all drunk." "Ah, nothing to signify," said Flurry, plunging in and driving his way through the throng like a plough. "Here, Mary Kate," he called to the girl behind the counter, "tell your mother we want some tea and bread and butter in the room inside." The smell of bad tobacco and spilt porter was choking. We worked our way through it after him towards the end of the shop, intersecting at every hand discussions about the races. "Tom was very nice. He spared his horse all along, and then he put into him. Well, At Goggins Corner the third horse was before.